Klinghoffer, a disabled Jewish New Yorker on a cruise with his wife and friends. The hijacking of an Italian cruise liner, the Achilles Laurel, was an incident that shocked the world. As you will soon hear, it continues to reverberate through the culture at large and through the lives of the families affected by this horrifying and senseless incident and its aftermath. Ms. Salamon is the daughter of Czech immigrants who were Holocaust survivors. She was raised in Ohio in a rural village of 800 people, where her father was the town doctor. A veteran reporter for the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, Julie has covered a wide range of subjects from business to philanthropy and the arts. She has also written numerous articles for the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, and the New Republic, among others. And if that is not enough, she is a notable best-selling author of 11 books, including The Devil's Candy and Wendy and the Lost Boys, as well as 2 children's novels. A common thread running through many of Julie's books are community and family. Ms. Salamon serves as the board chair of BRC, nonprofit organization that provides housing and treatment services for the homeless in New York City. An Innocent Bystander is a beautifully written and meticulously researched book. Julie interweaves the stories of the victims, perpetrators, and their families with intelligence, sympathy, humanity, and insight. At the same time, she sets the international stage where this tragic episode and its aftermath played out. Following Julie's talk, our committee member, Sandy Marcus, will moderate a Q&A with Julie. You'll be able to ask Julie questions by raising your hand and unmuting yourself, or if you prefer, you may post your questions in the chat function. We are so fortunate to have Julie with us tonight. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest speaker, author Julie Salamon.
Now I'm unmuted. Hi. I guess those are the first words now. Unmute myself. Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you, Sandy Albert. I know you're somewhere here on my screen for arranging this evening. There you are. I also was president of the Village Temple where Sandy is now. So that's how we made this connection. I have to tell you, it was very strange coming here tonight because it's been almost exactly 1 year since I did my last live book talk about Innocent Bystander in Denver, Colorado. I was a weekend scholar in residence at a big synagogue out there. And I didn't think anything about it, blithely flying from here to there to do book talks, and not too much of that anymore. So it was a lot easier getting here tonight. I just had to walk from the kitchen into my office. So it's a pleasure to be here. So I thought I'd start by telling you how I came to write this book. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it loud enough? Great. So as I mentioned, I belong to the Village Temple in Greenwich Village, and the Klinkhoffer daughters, Lisa and Ilsa, are also members at our temple. And in fact, Lisa's husband, Jerry Arbitier, was co-president with me at the temple. And in 1985, which would have commemorated the 30th anniversary of the hijacking of the Achilles Laurel, the Klinghoffer sisters decided to donate their family papers to the American Jewish Historical Society, which is on 16th Street, part of the Center for Jewish History, and they were going to have a big event as part of this presentation. And they invited a lot of people, including a lot of people from our synagogue. And so my husband and I decided to go, obviously to support, but also curiosity to see what it would be about. And it was an amazing experience because we went, there's a beautiful big auditorium there, and Lisa and Ilsa, with the help of the Center for Jewish History, had worked with a producer from the Moth Theater Company on how to tell their story almost as a piece of theater. And it was absolutely fantastic. It was really listening to this story of the hijacking, of the horrible thing that happened, the murder of their father, of not knowing what was happening. You know, you have to remember this is pre-internet, pre-Twitter, pre-anything. So, and they told this story from their point of view on this stage, and then they brought in guests to give their part of the story. So a guy who was the pilot on a plane that ultimately brought the hijackers to justice, what came and spoke about his role in it. The New York Times reporter who had covered the story came and spoke. And about halfway through the evening, I turned to my husband and I said, nobody's written a book about this. I think they should. It's just really interesting. And so a couple days later, uh, I approached Lisa and Ilsa, and I said, I'd be interested in thinking about writing this story. I mean, I don't know if there's a story yet, but it certainly seems like there could be something interesting. You know, it was a subject that really hit me where I live, because these were the people that the thing didn't happen to them directly. It happened to their parents, but it had a deep, obviously, effect on them. And as Bob said, I grew up, my parents were both Holocaust survivors. My grandparents all died in the camp. So this notion of being adjacent to the horror was a very familiar feeling to me. And so I met with Lisa Nelson. They said, sure, you know, they knew my work. They trusted me because they knew me from the temple, which is probably a mistake. You should never trust a reporter just in case any approach you, unless you have other reason to trust them. But that was sort of the beginning. And but the story turned out to be so different from what I expected, because I thought this was going to be the story of this hijacking and this murder, which it was, but it turned out to be a very large geopolitical story that said a lot about the Reagan administration and what the whole world situation was like in the 80s. It turned out to be a story about the hijackers and the family of the mastermind of the hijacking, Abu al-Abbas. That I certainly didn't expect to happen. And then there was a third family that got embroiled in this became collateral damage, I guess we would call it today, became collateral damage. And that was the family of Alex Odeh, who is a Palestinian American, born in Palestine, but eventually became an American citizen. And he lived in California and was doing a lot of the similar kind of work to what the ADL does, trying to foster, do sort of civil rights work on behalf of Palestinians in America, but also trying to do outreach with other communities, in particular Jewish communities. And the night that, so the day after the world found out about Leon Klinkhoffer's death, some local news station called Alex Odeh, who was a figure of some prominence in California, and he was supposed to speak at a synagogue that Friday night about what had happened. And they asked him to comment. And so he did a long interview with the reporters condemning the murder of Leon Klinkhoffer, but he was asked if he thought whether Yasser Arafat, who was then the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, if he had anything to do with it. And he actually did, but at that time, he was denying it. The US was not accusing him of it. And he said, no, he didn't have anything to do with it. And the next day he went to work, and when he opened the door to his office, a bomb went off. And that murder was never solved, but the FBI felt that the person who was responsible for it was a member of the Jewish Defense League. So all of a sudden, my story, which started off to be one thing, became this microcosm of the insanity that has gone on, as the rabbi said, probably since Cain and Abel walked on this earth. And so my story, the reporting for this story ended up taking me to Lebanon, where I certainly didn't think I would end up going, and to Israel, and to California, to the Reagan Presidential Archives, which has thousands of pages of documents about the Achilles Laurel. And so the third piece of the story, so we had the Alex Odeh story, the Klinghoffer story, and then the third part of the story came up when one day I realized, you know, I'm going to have to deal with the hijackers. And there was very little information about them, except that the mastermind was this guy, Abu al-Abbas, who was probably a rather low-level Palestinian leader, but who was a charming man who had a following. And these young men who went on the Achilles Laurel, and one of them ultimately murdered Leon Klinkhoffer, were his followers. So I one day was just sitting at my desk where I'm sitting here talking to you, and I start Googling around Abu al-Abbas, this and that, and up pops a book called The Curse of the Achilles Laurel, written by a woman called Reem al-Nimr, who was his wife, his second wife. And the book was just published a couple of years, well, now it's 3 or 4 years ago. And I thought, wow, I'd really like to talk to her. So first I ordered the book and I read it, and it was a fascinating book because it was how the Achilles Laurel basically ruined her family's life, her children's life. And it's also a history of her husband, where he came from, what led him to become a commander in the Palestinian Liberation Front, which was a more radical part of the PLO. And it was riveting. And what was most riveting was, I don't know what I thought the wife of a Palestinian terrorist leader should be like, but I didn't think she'd be like Reem. Reem is the daughter of an extremely wealthy banker. She grew up in Beirut. She's the exact same age as Lisa Klinghoffer. So she was a child of the 60s, wearing mini skirts and, you know, going to see the Beatles in London. They were a very wealthy family, driving around in sports cars. And not the background I quite anticipated. And then she became involved in politics in 1968, like students all around the world. And she met this handsome young guy, Abu al-Abbas. And eventually they got married. They both were married first to other people, but then ended up together. And so I read her book, and then I tracked her down on Facebook. And I sent her a message and I said, hi, I'm writing a book about the hijacking of the Achilles Laurel. Could I talk to you? And she wrote back within a day. And that began a very long series of correspondence, and then phone calls, and eventually a meeting in Beirut. And so, and I met all of her sons, and I met Alex Odeh's family, and then of course the Klinghofers. And so my book ended up being sort of a triage of these three stories and the intersecting point at which they met on the Achilles Laurel with this tragic and horrible killing. And then woven through the entire story, which I also hadn't quite anticipated, is the political story. Because as I said, there is a tremendous amount of information in the Reagan Library about why certain decisions were made, you know, there were all these international questions that came up with whether to storm the Achilles Laurel and try to take the hijacker victims off the boat that way, who should have jurisdiction over the hijackers, because they were eventually brought to justice in Italy, and the US wanted them because it was an American victim, but the Italians wanted it because it was an Italian ship. And so all of these different stories kind of weave together. And I will tell you, at various points, I felt as though I was writing a thriller, which was certainly not my intent when I began this project. But certain other issues came up during the writing of the book, as the daughter of Holocaust survivors, this whole idea of understanding, you have to confront the humanity of even the people who oppress you. And not always easy to do. And I watched the Klinghoffer sisters grapple with this. I brought to them a lot of information that they absolutely didn't know about. And so I think for me, the book became a way of looking at the history and the politics of the Middle East, of Israel, of the Palestinians, of American involvement there through this story. And it occurred to me at some point that for me as a writer, I think, since I know this is a book club, I think what's always fascinated me is the ripple effect. You throw a stone in the water and it has all of these ramifications. I guess in science they call it the butterfly effect, and certainly that was the case here. And ultimately it became just a tragedy all the way around. I mean, the hijackers were not supposed to kill Leon Klinkhoffer. They had this cockamamie mission that they were supposed to use the Achilles Laurel to get from Italy, where it left, and it was going around the Mediterranean and was supposed to end up in Israel. And so their mission, which was not a noble mission, was to get off the boat in Israel with their machine guns, because 1985 there were no weapon metal detectors getting on the boat, so they carried their AK-47s in their baggage, and they were supposed to shoot up the port. And their plan was so poorly concocted that one of them freaked out halfway through and basically started, when I say hijacked the ship, they started shooting in the ceiling and gathering all the passengers together in the dining hall. And then they literally didn't really know what to do. They had no plan. The youngest one was 17 years old. The two of them were 19, 20. The oldest one was 23. Everything about this hijacking was a disaster. And if it hadn't had such a tragic ending, it would have been like a Keystone Cops thing. But instead, it ended up being this horror. And I think a little side tragedy that I hadn't really thought of until I learned more of the details of this, that one of the reasons they chose, everybody always wants to know, how did they choose Leon Klinkhoffer? And I truly believe that he was murdered because he was in a wheelchair, not out of some kind of anti-disability idea on the part of these hijackers, but because they had this idea, because they were aware from being up in the radio tower that people were looking for the ship, and they knew the US would be coming, and they were worried. There was a flat deck on top. This was a huge ship with many floors, and there was a flat deck on top, and they were worried that a helicopter could land there from above. So they got the idea that they would put the passengers were from all over the world, but that they would take the British and the American passengers and put them on this top deck, which was not meant for passengers. There was no guardrail. And the only way you could get to it was by climbing up a stairs that was just somewhere between a ladder and stairway, one of those very narrow kind of stairs leading up, because this was really not for use. And they started herding the American and the British up, and Leon Klinkhoffer was in a wheelchair. The other floors of the ship had an elevator that he could take to get from floor to floor, but he couldn't go up. So they kept him, so his wife, Marilyn, had to go up, and they were traveling with several friends of theirs. So you can imagine what it was like for her to be separated from her husband. They were on this trip to take to celebrate their anniversary. And so they kept him down. And nobody knows exactly what happened, but it seems like Leon had had a stroke. That's why he was in the wheelchair. And there were many different versions of what happened because nobody really paid any attention. But the chief hijacker, the 23-year-old, basically either told him to do something, nobody really knows, and whether Leon objected or whatever he did, it couldn't have been too much since he was in this wheelchair. He had no weapon. But this Mulkey, the 23-year-old, took him away from where all the passengers were being held in this big dining hall. And he took him to a secluded area of the ship. And that's where he shot him. And he tried to throw him overboard and he couldn't do it because, somebody who's dead is just heavy. And so he went and he found the ship's hairdresser and a waiter, two young guys, and he made them come with him and they had to throw him overboard. So you can imagine the trauma for them as well. But all of this happened out of sight of the passengers, so nobody knew that it had happened. And Marilyn and the other friends were up on this other deck. So one of the most horrible stories I heard, I was able to interview the ambassador to Egypt, the American ambassador so ultimately, I'm not going to give away the whole story, but they ended up, the hijackers did end up in Egypt, promised some safe passage by the Egyptians. And after they got away, the American ambassador came on the ship to see what was going on. They still didn't know that Leon Klinkhoffer was dead. And I was able to track this ambassador down, who's still alive and very sharp still. And even now, so many years later, he really almost started crying as he was recalling going from door to door, just trying to talk to the passengers and then having to tell Marilyn that her husband was dead. And it was, the impact of it was just monumental. Now, subsequently, sadly, terrorism became commonplace. In those days, it was commonplace as well. I don't know if you remember, there were all these plane hijackings. There was all kinds of terrorism going around, but it didn't happen to United States citizens. We felt somewhat immune from it in 1985. It was a different era. And so I think when the news that Leon Klinkhoffer had been murdered, and I think also just this image of a man in a wheelchair being thrown overboard, it just seems so heartless. It reverberated around the world. And one of the things that they have in the Center for Jewish History archive that was so incredible going through that archive, they have folder after folder after folder, literally hundreds and hundreds of letters that people from all over the world wrote to the Klinkhoffers, from Jews, non-Jews, nuns, children. And some of them were literally addressed to the Klinkhoffer family in New York City. And they got those letters. And there was something so touching about that, that people, and you would see that outpouring later for Princess Di, for celebrities, but not for an ordinary person. And so, the story has so many different elements to it, that for me personally, it was just a really, I think it was a life-changing experience, and then to meet the Palestinian families who were people, the sons of Abu al-Abbas, who have been equally haunted by this story. None of them went into their father's business. They all left. Two of them live in Prague now, are Czech citizens, and one lives in Canada. One lives in Dubai. I went to Dubai to visit. I became very close to one of his sons, who's a documentary filmmaker, who was quite young when this happened, and who's been trying to understand his father's role in this and his father's story. So it was a really fascinating experience to uncover all this. And then I will say, probably the weirdest thing that happened to me during this was, and then I'll open it up to questions, but along the way, I did end up befriending an international arms dealer, which was not something I had expected either. Manzar al-Qassar, who was a good friend of Abu al-Abbas from Syria. They had been in university together. And Manzar is a real character. He became a billionaire selling arms to anybody and everybody. And he sold the arms or gave the arms to these young men. Now, for Manzar al-Qassar to give a few AK-47s was basically like handing $1 out to somebody panhandling or something. I mean, it was nothing for him. He dealt in major weapons. And so there's another story of these DEA agents who became obsessed with getting Manzar al-Qassar. They had tried to get him on the Achilles Laurel in Spain. He had this huge, he is or was until he got caught, a billionaire. He had this huge, beautiful mansion in southern Spain, and ultimately got caught by the US because he was selling arms. He got involved in the whole Iran-Contra thing. And so ironically, the US hunted him down, even though Oliver North bought arms for him during Iran-Contra. So the way that these international relations are very twisted and very hard to kind of trace to the bottom line was really interesting. So Manzar and I tracked down his lawyer, who put me in touch with him in federal prison in Illinois, and we became pen pals for quite a long time. So I have a whole envelope someplace of my correspondence with Manzar al-Qassar. And he was he's in the book, and he is quite a character. He was the best man at Reem and Abdul Abbas's wedding. And he really had a lot. He asked me to send him a free copy of my book, which I did in the end. So all I can say is journalism is a very strange profession sometimes. But I feel really proud of the book. I think I tackled a lot of difficult subjects, and I do want to say one thing kind of in memoriam. So I had a very, very wonderful editor at the New York Times, Jack Schwartz, who had been the book editor at Newsday and then became an arts editor at the Times. And he was also just a very learned person. And I'm just mentioning him here because I really wanted him to read the sections in particular about Israel and the history of Israel. And he was very helpful to me in that, just to make sure there's so many nuances. And I wanted to make sure, it's treacherous territory. And I wanted to make sure I went through it giving, appropriate weight to both sides without doing disservice to the history of Israel. And he was so helpful to me. And he died last week of COVID. It was so terrible. And I'm only mentioning it because maybe the rabbi can say Kaddish for him this weekend or something. But he was such an extraordinary man, and in my memory, very deeply embedded in the final product of this book. Because especially when you write nonfiction, but I think with fiction as well, the people who are the unheralded heroes of books are the editors. They save you from a lot of mistakes, both literary and factual. And I think a lot of writers don't give enough credit to them, but I really have been blessed to have wonderful editors, and Jack was certainly one of them. So that is, in a nutshell, a very big and complicated story. But I'd be glad to answer questions. And if you don't have any, I can talk some more. No questions? I've answered everything.
I'll ask a question. I don't have my picture up there, Paula Davis. Did you, I mean, I found the book fascinating and I really appreciate your writing it. For a couple of questions, were the sisters then, how did they like the way you handled the treatment of the story? Because I know you do try and provide a balance between the Palestinians, the Israelis. Sometimes, you know, it's harsh on the Israelis, sometimes it's harsh on the Palestinians. And of course, that thing about the opera was like crazy that they didn't want to talk to the sisters. And since you had been in touch with them in the beginning, how involved were they?
That's a great question. So they were incredibly involved. I mean, the way that the deal we had made at the beginning was they would have no control over the book because that it just has to be like that for journalistic independence. On the other hand, when I saw that the book was taking a different trajectory than what I'd anticipated, I had made a decision that I was going to keep them apprised of everything I was finding out pretty much in real time. So when I found out about Rimal Niemer, I told them about that and that I was going to interview him, and Alex Oda. I told them really every step of the way. And they have been truly remarkable. I think Sandy Albert can second that. I mean, they have been so supportive of the book. They have been truly extraordinary. I think for them, it was very difficult to read part of it, but I also think it helped answer so many questions that they had. I mean, they felt that for all the publicity they had that had arisen about this and all the mythology that had grown up around it, they didn't really understand what had happened. And, you know, there's another very important story in the book, which I haven't mentioned, and that's the story of Marilyn Klinkhoffer, who was a truly remarkable woman. She, you know, was with her husband throughout all of this, and she herself had cancer. She had cancer that was in remission. And, you know, she was just a very courageous and tough. She was a tough New Yorker in the very best sense of the word. And so I think for Lisa and Ilsa, it was not an easy thing to read, but I think it was helpful to them in some way. And so we did the launch of the book back in the same auditorium at the Center for Jewish History, where I had first gotten the idea to do it. And we had a huge packed house that night, and they participated in that. They spoke at the beginning, and they have just been, my hat's off to them. You know, they've been really great.
I have to apologize. I didn't realize I was still muted and I'm supposed to be monitoring the questions. Anyone who has a question, please raise your hand. And if you don't, I have some questions. First of all, I wanted to thank you for this book. Susan, you have a question? You're muted. You're muted.
I know,
Oh.
but now I'm not. Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
I want to know, you've taken on some big subjects with Wendy Wasserstein and this, your other. Is there ever a point that you say, I can't do this again. I can't, because, you know, you started with a huge subject, and it, you know, if there's a word, hugest, you got there. So what keeps you going? Or is it just curiosity?
That's a great question. I don't know. I have to ask my psychiatrist, I guess. I would say part of it is, you know, I know at least one person on this call who does Ironman triathlons. So I feel like it's a little, I mean, I've never done that, but I maybe say it's the same thing that, when I finished the Wendy Watt, every time I finished a big nonfiction book, I think, oh,
Mhm.
that's it. I'm not going to do this again. But then something comes along and it's hard to even explain. It's like falling in love. You don't know why you think, wow, this is it. This is the one that I'm going to throw myself into. But once you throw yourself into it, first of all, I do always sign a book contract and get some money up front, because then I know I'll have to finish it. Because once you've got that pressure of I'm not gonna fail at this job. And so that's part of it. But also it almost is like a Dybbuk that overtakes you. You become completely obsessed with it. And uh, and also, as I said, this story, you kind of then want to find out what happens next. You want to find out for yourself. And so, I mean, I read like I do a lot of things like that, but it's the same thing. You just sort of dive into it. Um, and it is a funny thing though, because I mean, not that I believe in astrology, but I am a Cancer by birth, and I'm definitely a homebody. And yet I think the only way I can ever force myself to leave the house is to throw myself into these projects. And then I'm in Dubai, so I'm not saying it's logical, but that is sort of how I roll.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Are there any other questions? Anybody else want to ask something? I wanted to say something. Reading this book for me was like a history lesson. It was such an amazing book, and it covered so much material. Well, first of all, I wanted to know, how long did it take you to do all the research and all the writing?
Well, it was it's very interesting, because I started working on the book at the very end of 1985, and it was published in, I mean, 1985, 2015, and it took 35, no, it took about 3 years from beginning to end. And to be honest with you, even 10 years ago, but certainly 15 years ago, it would have taken 10 years to do this book. It's just the way you can find, and it's a blessing and a curse, because now with the internet, the ability to track people down and to make connections is so fast once you are able to do it. Reem al-Nimr, I would have never found her. It would have been a different book. So you can work twice as hard in a shorter period of time. But it's a little stressful because you don't have that extra time to sort of just process things. So I will say that with this book, there were several avenues of research. So there were the archives, and the major archives were the Center for Jewish History with the Klinkhoffer archive. The Anti-Defamation League had a very good archive, because the Klinkhoffer sisters, and that's also a piece of the book, after their father died, really wanted to do something to make his death mean something. And so for the last really 20 years, they have worked with the ADL in anti-terrorism work and educational work. So the ADL has a sizable archive, and then the Reagan Library Archive was just overwhelming. I mean, they have thousands of pages of Achilles Laurel information, because, without going into the details now, the Achilles Laurel really was at the nexus of the Cold War. The US and the Russians were duking it out, and the Middle East was sort of in the middle of that. And poor Leon Klinkhoffer kind of wandered into the middle of that. So it's very complex. But I am working now on a 7-part podcast for Turner Classic Movies about one of my very first books, which was a book about the film business. I used to be a film critic, and this is a book where I spent a year embedded in the Bonfire of the Vanities when Brian De Palma turned it into a movie. And I think there's a part of me that's truly insane because I started working on that book when my daughter was just born. She was literally 5 weeks old. And in retrospect, I think that was pretty crazy. So this one by comparison was nothing. And she grew up fine. She's getting married actually. So that was all good.
Is anyone else? Feel free to raise your hand. Oops. Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Bob Epstein, I think, wants to ask something.
Thanks. Julie, I was, as
I just
being in,
lost the,
being in criminal law for a bunch of years, I was wondering if you could talk a little about the process of the trial of the hijackers in Italy and some of the interesting things that you found out about that.
Right. So the hijackers ultimately were caught, and they ultimately were tried in Italy. And that in and of itself became part of the book, is the trial. And that was an incredible experience. I ended up finding the lawyer who defended the hijackers, a defense attorney, and Giancarlo Pagano, really lovely guy. The way I found him is we have very good friends who live in Rome, and one of them is a lawyer, and she actually found him in Genoa. And so I sent him an email and he responded, and he had saved the entire trial transcript. And he sent me the whole thing from Italy. And so I interviewed him at length, and then I had the investigation, I had the interrogations of all the hijackers, of all the witnesses. Unfortunately, it was all in Italian, of which I speak nothing except maybe to order pasta. And so I had to hire a lovely woman who was incredibly helpful to me, who translated all these documents. But one of the things that was so interesting in the section on the trial is that it became almost a philosophical discussion, because the questions raised were not just about the murder, but was it an act of terrorism? And the hijackers argued that they weren't terrorists, but that they were basically soldiers in this army fighting a war against Israel. And they ultimately were not convicted of terrorism in Italy, which caused a big uproar here, but were convicted of murder. What was also interesting was that in Italy, they have a very, very different kind of criminal justice system. So if you're in jail for a certain period of time, you're allowed to take weekend furloughs, like in the army. So you can go off for the weekend and hang out, and 2 of the hijackers escaped because they went on furlough and they didn't come back. And so that was also just a fascinating aspect of this, the 2 very different systems of justice. But also in the book, I go into the various translations of how they defined an act of terrorism. And Italy at the time was going through its own political upheaval. I mean, I forget how many changes of government they'd had since World War II. And they had also been had many the what were they called, the red something, this, they were basically like mafia. So there was a lot of political turmoil going on in Italy, a lot of people far left who came to the trial and tried to disrupt it. They turned the whole town of Genoa into basically an armed camp during the trial of the hijackers, and they were kept in cages while they were being tried. So and then one of the youngest hijacker, the 17-year-old, who was not part of the killing of Klinghoffer, ultimately did a series of interviews with an Italian journalist who gave me permission to use those interviews, which told of his background. You know, he grew up in a refugee camp. He had never experienced a life without war. And, you know, one really terrible story after another.
Did you believe, one of the hijackers said that Abbas really planned this hijacking, and the terrorist attack in Israel was just a ruse to do this. One of the terrorists said that, but the other three never supported him. Do you think he was right? Do you think this was?
I don't think, I think that the plan was to go to Israel, because Abu al-Abbas had spent much of his very bad career as a terrorist trying to infiltrate Israel. At that time, he had tried to infiltrate it by hydroboat. He had tried to come in across the border. And he, not personally, he sent these young men who all had ended up in Israeli prisons. I know that one of the hijackers who kind of turned state's evidence was saying that that was not the plan. But the truth is, if you think about it rationally, if that was their plan, it was ridiculous to send 4 people to hijack a ship that had a crew of several hundred. And it's huge. It's not like hijacking an airplane, which is kind of compact. And they had sent them on this cruise several times. So they knew where the Israelis got on to check for security leaks between landing in Egypt and then coming to Israel. But having said that, we'll never know.
Right.
You know, my feeling was, judging from everything that these hijackers said at the trial, that they said in the interrogations, that the young one wrote in his book, and I ultimately interviewed him in person in Beirut, they were pretty clueless. I mean, they had them in Italy for 6 weeks before they got on the ship, supposedly waiting for their instructions. None of them spoke a word of Italian. They got on this ship with a Norwegian passport. These are 4 young men from, you know, Palestinians. One had a Norwegian passport. He was 19. He had the passport of a 40-year-old. I mean, the whole thing was, like I said, it was such a series of ridiculous mistakes at a time when, you know, planes were being hijacked in a way that was much more systematic and horrible. And even if the plan was to hijack, if the plan was literally to hijack the ship, it was so stupid that it's hard to imagine.
You know, speaking of hijacking planes, what did you think? I never knew this, that the United States actually hijacked the Italian plane. That
Oh yeah, that was the guy who came to speak. So what happened was, the ship was ultimately brought into port in Egypt, and the Egyptians were supposed to hold the hijackers to bring them to justice. And Mubarak, who was then the head of Egypt, basically lied to the Americans and said, "Oh, the hijackers have already left the country," when they were still at an Air Force base. The Israelis had his office bugged, so the U.S. intelligence had the lie right in front of them. But so they knew that the hijackers were at this Air Force base in Italy, and they took off. And then the pilot who ultimately spoke at Lisa and Ilsa's event in 1985, in 2015, was on an aircraft carrier, and he told the story of these F-14s basically intercepting this Egyptian civilian aircraft in space and then forcing it to land in Italy. And it was just, I mean, incredible. I spoke to the pilot of one of those F-16s, and he was so, he just gave the most incredible description of what it was like, because they didn't know what they were doing. All they knew was they were supposed to bring that plane down. They had no idea who was on it or what it had to do with until afterwards. And he was a lovely guy too. He ended up teaching high school chemistry or something in upstate New York.
If somebody would have shot, it could have been a real
International
disaster.
incident.
Right, right.
Right. And the other thing that was so interesting about it was within the Reagan government, between Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz, that, you know, they had a real disagreement about what action to take. And Oliver North was sort of in the middle of this, really pushing a more aggressive action. And so a lot of this probably doesn't make sense if you haven't read the book, but within the context, it's just, again, one of the other ripple effects that flowed out of this hijacking.
You also talked about, in the book, you also talked about the firestorm, about the opera. What do you think that it was justified? This, I know the rumor scene was taken out, which was satirizing the Jewish suburban empty life, trivial life. That was taken out. So do you think without that scene that I never saw I'm not a big modern opera fan.
So neither am I, and I had never seen the opera until it was revived in New York right before I started working on the book, the year before or 2 years before, when Giuliani was leading protests in front of Lincoln Center when they revived the opera without the offending. There was one scene when it first came out in 1990 that everybody got all upset about. So I went with a few friends of mine, and it seemed pretty inoffensive. I mean, clearly the Klinkhoffers were the heroes of the play. The best songs went to Marilyn and Leon. And I think it was just the moment in time in the 90s. I just think it became very politicized, just like everything does around the Middle East. And when it was revived in New York now, most of the people who were protesting hadn't seen it. So it was, but I did include the opera in the book because it had become such a big part of their story.
It was very interesting. Your background with about the opera was I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, no, it was really great. And Peter Sellers, who was the original producer, and John Adams, the composer, both cooperated and spent quite a bit of time with me talking to me about it. So it was very helpful. Interestingly, the woman who wrote the opera, who was a Jewish woman from Milwaukee, while she was writing it, was going through her own turmoil. She ended up marrying an Anglican priest and converting to Christianity and becoming an Anglican priest herself, which is what she does now in England. So there you go.
Another thing I'm ashamed to admit, I never heard of Alex Oda. And it was just, to me, it was just heartbreaking. To me, he was as much of a heroic victim of what happened as Leon Klinghoffer.
No, I felt so too. And I felt like, so Alex Oda was the Palestinian American guy who got murdered. And his story, because he was just a lovely person, and he had 3 young daughters, like little girls. And you know, that was also a tragedy. That story got 1 day of coverage and then it was over.
That's, and you mentioned in the book that Norma, his wife, she sort of resented the fact because he was just as much a victim. And I think that the perpetrators of that bombing were every bit as evil, as guilty as the one terrorist who killed Leon Klinkhoffer, because I don't think the other ones evidently didn't want to. The one actually wept when he found out what happened.
Yeah. No, and I think part of what it is that I think, you know, look, we've seen it in the country here in great proportion. In the last 20 years, I read someplace, probably the New York Times, that most of the acts of terrorism that have taken place in the United States over the last 20 years have been, white supremacists, and so I think there's, at this time when this thing happened with Alex Oda, there were very few domestic acts that were labeled terrorism, but the FBI did consider his murder an act of terrorism, but the person who did it was never brought to justice.
Yeah, that was really heartbreaking. And I felt bad that I had never heard of this man, because he was evidently really he was a peacemaker, and I guess we always kill our peacemakers. He was he was trying to reach out to the Jewish community, and I think it's really a shame. Let me ask you one. Oh, here's a question. I see somebody has a
Yeah.
question.
Paula, I have
Paula.
another question. I have lots of questions about this book. I loved it. So one other question is, I know that you have to cut somewhere, or you could go on and on and on, but the ship had a lot of other people on it at the time, and between staff and I know you focused just on those who were directly affected, but did you interview a lot of the other people from the ship, and were they also party to when the case was brought? Did they allow any of the other people on the ship to testify?
So a few people on the ship testified. I ended up interviewing the children of many of the people who were on the ship, because a lot of the people who were on the ship weren't alive anymore. A lot of the people, this was in October, so most of the people on the ship tended to be retirees. So most of the people were already in their 50s and 60s on the ship, and this was now 30 years later. So among the friends of the Klinghofers, I had to rely on their children. So I did interview a lot of those people, but I did make a decision at the beginning. And the captain of the ship, who had really just died a couple of years before, but he wrote a memoir in Italian. So I did get his memoir, and he testified at the court. So and a lot of the passengers did testify in court, and I did have their testimony. But in the course of writing a book, it's a great question. You always have hard decisions you have to make about what stays and what goes. And so there were already so many stories in this book that I think I just decided to focus in on the Klinghofers and their friends, the Odas, and then the Abu al-Abbas family. But there were many interesting stories. I mean, because the American and the British were only a very small percentage of the passengers. Most of the passengers were European. So there were a lot of Germans and Italians and people from
Where were they during this? Were they just kept in their rooms?
No, everybody was in the, I think I write about it in the book, when they
So-
were all brought to that big central dining room.
Right, but then the American and the British were separated.
They were separated and sent up to that other deck, but everybody else stayed downstairs. So and there were only 4 hijackers. So one group, and they also definitely developed a little bit of Stockholm syndrome. I mean, both ways. I mean, the hijackers were serving them sandwiches and making sure they
were
had
hugging.
food, and they were hugging. I mean, when they left, literally, they were clapping, because nobody knew that Klinkhoffer had been killed, and there was a lot of sympathy for them among the passengers. So it was this and the other thing that was interesting, I mean, here we always thought that Leon Klinkhoffer was singled out because he was Jewish, but I would say that almost 99.9% he was singled out because he was American. But there was no way that these young guys knew that they were Jewish. They didn't speak English. Klinkhoffer was not a religious person. He wasn't wearing a kippah. And so it was, like I said, I think it was literally because he became a pain in the neck to them, or the guy just lost it. We'll never know exactly what happened. But
Julie, you did mention in the book that there was a Austrian Jewish couple that they put, an elderly couple that they put with the British and the American prisoners. So that sounds like, I don't know, that sounds like they're picking on them because they're Jewish.
right, although we don't really know. I mean, they never said to them, "You're a Jew." They would say, for them, I think, from what it sounds like, to that these young guys, they didn't know about Jews. They knew about Israelis. So to them, a Jew was an Israeli. Ironically, there were a couple of Israeli passengers on the ship who were not separated out. They must have thrown their passports away or something. So, honestly, we can't really know what they knew, but I would say that I remember talking to Reem, and she said until well after this happened, she said they didn't know about the Holocaust. They didn't know anything except that Jews were Israel. They had stolen their, it was like this mantra, just sort of indoctrination.
That's interesting. I have one more question to ask. You had all these interviews. Was there which one of all your interviews that you did was, you think, the most significant and the most meaningful to you? Tough.
Boy, that's a tough one. In some ways, I don't know if this was the most meaningful, but I would have to say, speaking to Max Klinghoffer, who's the son of Ilsa, and to the son of Abu al-Abbas, those two interviews had the most impact on me, because I saw two young people grappling with this history, dealing with, trying to understand it. Both of them of a generation where they were trying to be more open to other people and other ways of thinking, and yet still having this family history of the one dealing with guilt or feeling, betrayed in a way by his memory of his father, and on Max's side trying to, having seen how his mother, Ilsa, has spent so much of her life trying to figure out how to move forward in a way that made this death not a complete loss. So I think those two interviews had a lot of resonance for me.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming or on Zoom and for speaking to us. And most of all, thank you so much for writing this wonderful book. Bob, do you want to take over and finish? But thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much. Bob, you're on mute.
Bob, you're on mute.
You're mute.
How's that?
Good.
Thanks so much for sharing your story with us. It was told with so much compassion and pathos, and it is a wonderful book. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't read the book as yet to get the book, buy the book. It's you won't be disappointed. And we hope maybe sometime with in the future. I know you have another book coming out, maybe perhaps a memoir.
Oh yeah.
Maybe we can hopefully meet you in person over at our temple someday and invite you as our guest again.
I'd love that. I'll give a pitch for my new book. It's actually not a book, it's an audio book. I was commissioned to do an Audible original. These are books that Audible is commissioning authors to do, books that are made particularly for audio. And they're somewhere between a book and a radio play, because people you interview, their voices are in it. So they asked me to do one about growing up in Seaman, Ohio. So it's the story of me and my two best friends, one of whom was the only Black girl in town. I was the only Jew, and our third friend is Appalachian, 5 generations back.
Oh,
So
Mhm.
Anyway, I'd be glad to talk to you about it. And I hope coming in person would be a great pleasure to go anywhere in person.
Sure, sure. Well, thank you again, and
Thank
thanks,
you.
thanks to everybody for joining us, and thank you, Sandy, for moderating, and